Today, I'd like to try something a little bit dangerous. But before we start, there are a couple of things I need to disclose. What I'm about to show you can cause memory loss, poor vision, fatigue, arthritis, difficulty walking, and lasting psychological damage. Those over the age of 60, I'd recommend shielding your eyes. Younger members of the audience should be fine. The side effects won't kick in for a couple of decades. Okay, so when you're ready, I'd like you to keep your eyes on the screen. Don't worry, those of a sensitive nature can just look away now. Okay, we'll begin on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Pretty shocking, isn't it? Or at this point, you're wondering why I'm showing you a birthday card. I'd like to tell you a story to explain why. It was 2007 in Jackson, Mississippi. A 27-year-old man, known as Mr. A, was suffering from depression, so he decided to enroll in a trial for a drug which might help. He was given a bottle of pills and told to take one every day. But the days passed, and sadly, Mr. A didn't feel any better. In fact, at a particularly low point, he took the whole lot. That's 29 times the usual dose. Luckily, he immediately regretted his decision, and he rushed to hospital. It looked pretty serious. His blood pressure had plummeted, and he collapsed at reception. The on-duty doctor gave him intravenous fluids while he began a series of tests. But they couldn't find any trace of the drug in his system. After hours of monitoring, a doctor finally arrived with an explanation. Mr. A had been in the placebo group. In other words, he'd overdosed on 29 sugar pills. When he heard the news, Mr. A rapidly recovered. You've probably heard of the amazing healing powers of the placebo effect. Well, this is the opposite. This is the nocebo effect. It's the curse of negative expectations, which have the power to harm your health. In 2015, there were 900 million people over the age of 60. That's enough centenarians to populate Iceland. But governments warn us of rising pension bills and a rapidly aging workforce. Scientists tell of an inevitable decline into failing senses and medical interventions. Newspapers talk about aging as a time bomb, a disaster on the scale of the financial crisis. If you look it up in a dictionary, you'll find old is a synonym for worn out, hackneyed, and obsolete. As a society, we've turned aging into a threat. But have we got it all wrong? And could this negative view be undermining our health? I don't know about you, but in my experience at least, our expectations just don't stack up in reality. In the lab in Cambridge where I used to work, the room with its lights still on at 10 p.m. wasn't the office of a hard-working student, but an 84-year-old professor. Then there's my dad. Last year, he gave up his management job, threw away his reading glasses, and at 64 years old, he started a property renovation business. After a long career in a suit, most days he's covered in plaster or paint. Last week, he hacked a bathtub to pieces with a hammer. That's my dad. I'm only 27, but I just can't believe growing old is as bad as we think. So last year, I started doing some research. I found all kinds of surprising benefits, which I wrote up into an article for the BBC. So here's my whistle-stop tour of the upsides of aging. I'm going to show you the happiness curve, a graph which shows how our happiness levels change over our lifetimes. As you can see, in general, we start out life pretty happy. From the age of 18, we become less content, eventually reaching midlife crisis point in our early 50s. But then, as we approach our late 60s, we become more satisfied with our lives again. In fact, by the time we're in our 60s, it's likely we'll never have been happier. This U-shaped curve is no fluke. It's based on data from over 340,000 Americans. This is the immunity curve. The small peak shows what happens when the body first encounters a virus. It mounts a small immune response. The second peak shows what happens when the virus returns after years, even decades. This, in a nutshell, is immunity. And the older you are, the more viruses your body will remember. So those over the age of 50 catch half as many colds as the average 20-something. The final chart shows the results of the longest-running study into intelligence. And you can probably guess it at this stage. By the time the participants reached their 40s, 50s, and 60s, they were better at nearly every skill tested than they were in their 20s. So looks like older really is wiser after all. Studies have shown that if you tell girls they're bad at maths, they'll be worse at maths. If you tell someone they're fat, they'll eat more. If you tell someone they're ill, they'll get sick. Aging is no different. Studies have shown that when older people are reminded of the stereotypes, suddenly they don't have such a good memory anymore. Being patronizing or speaking too slowly makes them less intelligent. These subconscious reactions can be triggered by something as innocent as a birthday card. Right, so I've shown you 3 graphs, but I know I'm not going to overturn your preconceptions about aging just like that. But I'm not done yet. I'm going to tell you a story which I hope will help to convince you otherwise. In 1979, Ellen Langer was a young psychologist at Harvard University. She recruited a group of elderly men for a study and split them into 2 groups. Both groups were told they were going away for a week of reminiscence, and both groups were sent to stay in an old monastery just outside of Boston. But while the first group really would be reminiscing, the second group was doing something much more exciting. They were being sent back in time. The psychologist surrounded the men with props from the 1950s and asked her subjects to act like it was 1959. They watched old films, listened to old movies, and kept up with the news on vintage radios. They discussed Fidel Castro's march into Havana in the present tense and admired NASA's first ever satellite launch like it happened yesterday. They lived their lives like they were 20 years younger. There was no specialist equipment and no help. Nothing to remind the men they were anything but young and healthy. The impact was dramatic. When the men first arrived, they could barely carry their own suitcases. By the time they left, they were making their own meals, walking faster. As they boarded the bus to leave, they broke out into a spontaneous game of American football. Professor Langer's tests before and after the retreat showed their gait, arthritis, dexterity, memory, even vision improved in both groups, though the time travelers improved the most. A group of independent judges even said they looked younger. Many of the world's most influential thinkers, Angela Merkel, Ban Ki-moon, Warren Buffett, they're over the age of 60. This is an elite whose actions move the planet. And they're old. We need to grow out of our negative expectations. We need to move on from the idea that aging is a social burden. We need a new way to think about old age. So the next time you're hanging out with your grandparents or you find an older person's job application on your desk, I'd like you to think of this talk. Just remember, they could be smarter, happier, and healthier than you are. Changing the way you think won't just help those around you. It may just change the way you age yourself. At the very least, I hope you'll think twice about buying a tasteless birthday card again.